So welcome back to my channel. I am Jason and this is from Sin's Perspective Reviews. And I was going through some of the shows that I watch, and clearly I watch more shows than I recap on this channel. And so I thought that I might go through some of the shows that I watch and do recaps for those. Some of the shows may still be on, some are not, like the show that I'm going to recap today, or at least the episode that I'm going to recap today. It's Rosemary and Thyme, Season 1, Episode 1, and No Birds Sing. Now, the two lead characters are Felicity Kendal, who plays Rosemary Boxer, and Pam Ferris, who plays Laura Thyme. And so, every time I see Pam Ferris, I just think of Mrs. Trunchbull from Matilda. It's like, okay, that's Mrs. Trunchbull. Now, I know that she's been in a lot of shows. She's been in the industry for a long time. And so, I used to watch Call the Midwife. I haven't seen it in a while, but I do know she was a regular on there. I'm not sure if she's still a regular on the show as a midwife, but I think that was one of the more recent shows that I've seen her on. But to get into this show, so it opens with Laura Thyme. She's leaving her house. We know at this point we know not why. We know not where she's going. We just know she's leaving. The driver's loading her bags into the car, and she's on her way. And then we flash to Daniel, Alicia, and Sam. Daniel and Alicia are married, and you can clearly see that Sam has some type of skin condition, some type of eczema or something. Alicia is putting some cortisone cream on his skin, and he's talking about how he doesn't want to live like this and how he doesn't want to be a burden to her, and she's trying to reassure him that no, you're not a burden. I love you, and things are going to be fine, and so everything's okay. Let's just she's continuing to put the cream on him. So Sam chimes in and he starts talking to him because Daniel wants to give this rather large donation to this university, and Sam who's his business partner, is like, okay, for the amount of money that you want to give to this university, we can open 3 more branches. And so it was more important for Daniel. He wants to leave a legacy behind. He says alma mater. This is where he got into plant. All the stuff that he knows about plants. This university holds a soft spot for him, and so he decided that he wants to donate. They don't specify the amount, but it was enough to ruffle Sam's feathers, right? We finally see Rosemary and Julian. Rosemary and Julian actually work at the university that Daniel attended. I think Daniel was actually one of her students. I think during the show she indicated he was one of their more mature students, or he was an older student. And they're actually on their way to talk to him about the donation. Rosemary has a PhD in plant pathology or something to that effect, and I think Julian actually runs the school. So Julian is Rosemary's boss. So we flash back to Daniel. The doctor is there, and he's telling him that his lungs sound clear, his chest sounds a lot better, but his skin is not improving. And then he starts asking him if he's using the cortisone cream as he prescribed. And it's like, we use it all the time. And he asked if they needed more. And of course, Alicia said, we can always use more. And so, Sam, has a heart condition. And so while he was there, he asked the doctor to write him a prescription so that he can get a refill on his heart medication. So Rosemary and Julian, they're on their way. And then Julian starts going into, whatever happened to us? And he starts going into, at some point they had a romantic relationship. It fell apart. I think they indicated it lasted for like 8 months. And he was like, I think we should give it a try, give it another try. And Rosemary was like, you know what? I think we should leave things the way they are. We were terrible together. We were hell on wheels. And things are ended the way they ended. And then she made a joke like, I can never date anyone who pronounces both R's in February, right? And so that was a little chuckle, right? So Rosemary and Julian arrives at Daniel's house, and this is when they meet Mrs. Potts. Mrs. Potts answers the door, and she's all crotchety and like, "What are you guys doing here?" And they're like, "And who are you?" And she's like, "That's not what I said. That's not what I asked." And so Alicia came to the door and was like, "It's okay, Mrs. Potts." So they ended up letting them both in. They started talking to Daniel about the donation, and they started going over the paperwork, and he was telling them that if they needed, whatever changes they needed to make to the paperwork, that would be fine. And, around this time, Mrs. Potts came in, and she brought a tray of tea. And so she made the point to mention that, Sam's tea was different because they know that he's aware that he has a heart condition, so his tea can't have any caffeine or anything like that, and so his is in a different glass than everyone else's. And so you see him reach for the glass. He grabs the glass to drink out of it, and Julian and Rosemary are talking to Daniel about, the donation. And then he mentions the sick trees. I think Daniel had mentioned something to Julian about sick trees. And then he just volunteered Rosemary to stay and look after these trees. And so she's kind of like, oh, okay. So Laura arrives at her location, and we realize that it's at Vicky and Sam's house. The same Sam who's partners with Daniel. But, of course, she didn't announce her arrival, so when Vicky answered the door, she kind of confused, and then initially she didn't really remember Laura. She kind of looked at her confused and okay. And then Laura had to say, well, Laura, and she's like, oh, okay, so you should come in then. Like, she's kind of thrown off, obviously you don't just show up at somebody's house unannounced and uninvited with luggage, okay? That's just not how you do things. So she lets her in and, directs her into the living room. Rosemary and Julian are walking the property, and they're kind of talking about the sick trees, and you can kind of tell that there's like some gelatinous stuff that's on the trees, and, the trees are dying and the whole thing. And then the next thing you know, a taxi comes. And she was like, okay, well, Julian is like, okay, well, it seems like you got this under control. And he goes to go get in the taxi. And she looks at him like, okay, so you're just going to leave me here to deal with this? And who's going to take over my classes? And, the whole thing. And he basically assured her that everything was going to be okay. And he basically left her to deal with the sick trees. He took the paperwork for the donation, and he left her to deal with the sick trees. Laura is she's in her sitting room, and Vicky comes in, and she's like, well, I called Sam, and Laura goes into, he left me for I think she was like 23 or 24-year-old, and you can see Vicky's face like, oh, okay. So Sam eventually arrives, and, they're talking, and she's like, well, you knew that he was cheating, and of course Sam was like, I don't know what you're talking about, because it's obvious that Laura doesn't have a relationship with Vicky, because Vicky, obviously, when she initially opened the door, didn't really even know who Laura was initially. And, when they sat down to talk, Vicky left the room and closed the door. So her conversation was with Sam. And so it seemed like they're friends with Sam, and Vicky is, kind of friends with them through Sam, and she don't really know them. And so Laura is like, you knew and you didn't say anything. He's like, I didn't know he was like, I feel that he would be the last person to do something like this. And she was like, you're right. Like he said, all these years he pretended to be a decent human being, and then he turned out to be just like the rest of you, right? So I kind of chuckle because I'm kind of looking at like Sam was like, well, what did I do? But he didn't say that. So he ends up taking her to a hotel. Now, he apologized for not being able to, accommodate her that night. But I'm like, what do you expect? You just show up at somebody's house unannounced and uninvited. And his wife probably said, no, we're not doing that. So anyway, he took her to a hotel. And she happened to be in staying in the same hotel that Rosemary was staying in. So you can see Rosemary in the dining room as Sam and Laura walks in. And so they talked for a little while, and he got her all checked in. And then he was like, his watch went off as an alarm. He's like, oh, it's time for me to take my medicine. So he's taking his medicine, and she asked him, okay, well, what is all that about? And so he tells her that he has a heart condition, and he has to take the medicine, at a certain time, the whole thing. He gets her checked in, and they agree that he would pick her up at like 8:30 the next morning. And so she goes into the dining room, and and you can see Rosemary's already in there. waiting for her food. And so she gets seated. And then she's in there for a while, and then she just has an emotional breakdown, and she leaves out. And you can kind of see Rosemary look over, and she kind of looks concerned, right? And so Rosemary heads to her room, you can kind of hear Laura still crying, and she kind of almost like she wanted to knock on the door to see if she was okay, but she just decided to mind her business, and she just went into her room. So you flash to Sam, he's headed home. And then all of a sudden, you can see that he starts having some issues. Like he starts grabbing his chest, and he's you can see that he's in pain. And so the next thing you know, he slumps over and he runs a stop sign, and he gets T-boned by a truck, which basically knocks him off the road, right? So the next morning, you see Laura, she's waiting because the last conversation she had with Sam was that he was going to come and pick her up. And so Laura, so both Laura and Rosemary there, waiting. Well, Laura was calling Sam but didn't get an answer, and Rosemary was sitting waiting for Laura to finish her phone call. And so Rosemary ends up calling her assistant because she knew she was going to be there for a while. So she asked her assistant to get her house keys and bring her like a change of clothes and some stuff from the lab and a laptop and the whole thing, because she knew she was going to be working out there for a minute, at least until she figured out what was going on with the trees. And so Laura and Rosemary starts talking, and she finds out that Rosemary doesn't know Sam. She briefly met him when she went to the house to talk to Daniel about the donations. So she agreed to give Laura a ride. So as they're riding, of course, she starts going in about her husband, about how he left her, cheated on her with this 22-year-old, and of course, they come upon the accident. Now, of course, Laura already knew she knew Sam's car, so she already knew there was Sam's car. So that she got out of the car and went over to talk to the people, and they basically said that he had drove through the drove through the stop sign. This is the truck driver saying, and that he got hit. And so she asked about the driver, and he didn't really say too much about the driver. And so, but obviously by the conversation, she knew that he did not make it. And, she's sitting there talking to Rosemary. She's like, well, that just doesn't sound like him. He was the most cautious driver I knew. Vicky used to joke with him about how, slow he drove, or how he was a defensive driver. And she was like, Vicky was much more slapdash. Like, it doesn't make any sense. And so she was about to walk back to the hotel, but Rosemary was like, you know what? It's not going to do you any good to go back there and, deal with this on top of dealing with, your husband and the whole thing. And do you want me to take you to Sam and Vicky's house? And she was like, no, I just, she, never really cared for me at the best of times. And I guess she didn't want to be the one to break the news to her. So it was agreed that she would go with Rosemary back to Daniel's house so that she could start work on diagnosing whatever the issues are with the garden. As they pulled up, Vicky was already there. So she was already there. She had just gotten there, and the doctor and Alicia, who's married to Daniel, was there to greet her. And of course, she's emotional because she's already gotten the news that her husband died. And so at this point, Laura had to kind of deal with this. And so she, saw Vicky, and Vicky, of course, was like, well, he said he was only going to be gone for 20 minutes. And, it's an emotional scene, right? And as she's escorting Vicky, she's walking with Vicky, consoling Vicky into the house. She, Alicia goes ahead of them because Miss Potts is vacuuming or something, and Miss Potts tells her, she should stop for now because, there's other stuff going on. And so as they walk through, you kind of see Rosemary look over, and it's almost like she recognized Mrs. Potts, but she couldn't place her, right? And so you can see Mrs. Potts kind of looking at her, but Mrs. Potts always looked crotchety and evil. So, there was nothing new about that. So, once they got, I guess, Vicky situated, Laura went back outside to talk to Rosemary. And so Laura is kind of like, they're actually buying this, and she's really not buying this whole, he ran the stop sign and the whole heart attack and the whole thing. She's like, Oh, I should have said in the beginning that Laura Thyme actually used to be a police officer, and she gave that up when she got married and became a parent because she wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. So she was an officer at one point. And so her spidey senses are tingling, and she's like, there's something about this isn't right, and the fact that they're so willing to buy the story doesn't make any sense. And then Rosemary tells her that there's something that might be going on between the doctor and Elise, because she saw them in an inappropriate embrace, basically. And so now Laura is her wheels are spinning. And so they're kind of walking the property, and then they come across this huge plant. And she was like, oh, that's hogweed. That's a big hogweed. And she was like, isn't that poisonous? And so Rosemary was like, yes. She was like, so they're she's like, why is this plant here, right? So they get back to the hotel, and Rosemary's assistant is there with the stuff that she requested, along with something else. So she starts talking. So Rosemary's assistant gives her, I thought, I should be the one to give you this. And she was like, hey, there was a few other people in the department that got the same thing. And so Rosemary opens the envelope. It is a letter basically saying that she was being laid off. She was being let go. And remember when I said that Julian was her boss? So this MFer tried to rekindle a relationship with her, then volunteered her to stay there to help them figure out what was going on with them plans, all while knowing that she was being let go. Okay? So you can understand that she, at this point, is seething, right? So, Rosemary is back on the property because she's still doing the work for some reason. And while she's doing the work, she kind of see Miss Potts kind of walking by. She has this knife in her hand with this trash bag, and she's kind of seeing like, where is she going? Like, looking all Mrs. Potts like all evil and sketchy, right? And so, as she's following her, the next thing you know, you hear a scream and a thump. And she runs over, and she's still kind of peeking behind the bushes, and you see the doctor runs out, and then he's calling for Elise, and then you see Daniel on the ground. And so they're trying to figure out, well, what happened? Well, where were you? And did he jump? Did he fall off? Like, they're trying to figure out, like, what happened after this man ended up under this balcony. So, of course, they call for the paramedics, and, they take him away. So Rosemary is back at the hotel, and she's telling Laura, what she saw. And so she tells Laura, tells Laura about Mrs. Potts and being all sketchy. And then she tells her about Daniel at the bottom of under the balcony. And she's like, well, why didn't you say anything? She was like, well, I couldn't say anything. How could I explain while I was there? Because, she was kind of creeping around. Because she was creeping, trying to find out what Miss Potts was up to. So she was like, how can I explain why I was hiding behind the bushes? So, they talked for a little bit. And so they end up going back to the house. And when they got back to the house, sorry, I was kind of looking at my notes. That was kind of rude. And they got back to the house, but when they got back to the house, Laura recognized the car. And she was like, that bastard. So Julian came back to the house. So she went into the house, and she said what she had to say to him. You double-crossing, double-dealing, blah, 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 bastard. And she punched the crap out of him, and he went back on the sofa. She stormed out. Laura got out of her way, and she was like, oh my God. She said, what weight do you fight at? And Laura, they had this whole conversation. She was like, I've never hit anybody before, and that felt good, the whole thing, and he deserved it too. What a piece of crap, right? So they get back to the hotel, and now they about to sit down and sip a little bit. They got their bottle of wine, they got their glasses, and so they start talking. And the next thing you know, she was like wither sedge, because Laura had brought that up before. She was like, it's something about wither sedge that came to her, right? And so they started. Rosemary starts looking it up on the computer, and it's this website about people that got away with it. And then she realized it's a website talking about people that got away with murder. And then she was like, the Wicked Witch of Wither Sedge. And so that's what rung a bell with Laura, she's like, I knew that woman, Miss Potts. I think Delia Kettle, because she was like, I remember this story because when I first joined the force, it was the biggest. It was like the biggest news in the going on at that time, the biggest case. They knew she did it. They didn't have enough evidence to convict her, and she went free. And so they pulled up the photo, and it's like, well, it does still kind of look like her. It looks like she's wearing a similar cap, and so Laura ends up calling her son, Matthew, who's also he's a detective as well, officer as well. And she wants him to do a background check on Delia Kettle, which is, the Wicked Witch of Withersage, and to see what happened to her, where she ended up. And so, of course, he reluctantly, he decided he was going to do the background check. But while they're waiting on the background check, they are still, Rosemary's still determined to finish the work at the house. So Laura, they get there, and at this point, Laura is there to help her out. And so there's some tool that they needed. And Rosemary remembered that there was a garden shed around the corner. So they go in there, and they see these huge tubs of this cortisone cream. And Rosemary's like, do they use this in gardening? I don't think so. And so she opened it, and you saw where she opened it, and she put it on the back of one of her hands, and she was like, oh, it's just cream. And then Rosemary saw this crushed up plant in the corner. And then next thing you know, they hear, what are you doing here? They turn around. It's Mrs. Potts standing there with another damn knife. Like, this is private property, and you shouldn't be nosing around here, and you need to leave. And so, of course, they got out as quickly as they could. And they're like, oh my God, my chest, my heart was in my chest. Like, they're all scared, right? Because, of course, she turned around and somebody's standing there with a butcher knife, right? Rosemary remembered the hogweed. No, so I'm trying to remember. Oh my God, I'm getting something mixed up. So Rosemary, after they left, they were, after they were walking and talking, Rosemary realized that her back of her hand started burning or something, and she looked at her hand, and she's like, I don't know what they did that. And so eventually she realized, oh yes, I do. It's where I put the cortisone cream. And then Rosemary remembered the hogweed. And then she went back over to the hogweed, and she saw that a lot of the stalks had been cut off. And she was like, I thought that maybe this was some half-hearted attempt from someone trying to remove it. But it could be that because this plant is illegal because it's toxic, it's poisonous. And so it seemed like, and then she remembered the crushed up leaves in the shed. And she was like, somebody must be crushing this up and putting the juice inside the cortisone cream. And so that's why she had that reaction on the back of her hand. And if you notice, if that's the reaction she had on the back of her hand for that little small amount that she put, you can imagine this is the same cortisone cream that's being smeared all over Daniel's body. Right? So they realized that somebody's been putting this stuff in the cortisone cream, and this is probably why Daniel looks the way that he looks and the whole thing. And so they decide that they're going to split up, right? So Rosemary is going to go in to warn Elise of Mrs. Potts, and Laura is going to go to talk to the doctor. So the doctor ends up coming to the hotel, and he starts treating her for the burns, and they talk a little bit. And as they were leaving, the phone rang. And so the front desk clerk told Laura that he had a call for her. It was Matthew giving her an update on his research. And he found out that Mrs. Potts, Delia Kettle, had a daughter. And they kept getting into trouble. And eventually they kind of disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to them. And her name was Alicia Kettle. And so Laura then comes to the conclusion that Elise is actually Mrs. Potts, aka Delia Kettle's daughter. And now she realized that Rosemary has gone in some attempt to inform Alicia that Mrs. Potts may be responsible for the deaths of two people. And she now realized that Laura is now the one that needs saving. Rosemary is the one that needs saving. So it flashed to Rosemary. So Rosemary is talking to Laura. I keep saying Laura, Alicia. And Alicia is like, well, that sounds like an interesting story. She was like, yeah, I just thought that you should know. And so she rings the bell, I guess, the servants to notify the servants that they, that they need them to come up. And she said, well, we should have Miss Potts come up here and let her explain herself. And so, of course, Rosemary sitting there like, you mean like face to face? Like I wasn't planning on talking to her. So Miss Potts come up. And of course, Miss Potts comes up with another damn butcher knife. And so she was like, well, Miss Potts, Rosemary has an interesting story. So she was like, so so I think that you should hear what she has to say, mommy. Right? And so Rosemary's like, mommy. She was like, oh, this is Alicia. Like, oh, okay. So I guess that part you didn't put together. So next thing you know, they're chasing Rosemary down the hall. She got this damn butcher knife. She's, trying to close doors. Of course, the whole thing with the fight, trying to keep them out of the room. And she ends up running out on the balcony and starts screaming, for her life. I mean, it's a huge estate, so I don't know who else will be there because we haven't seen anybody else. And as they were approaching her, coming through the sliding glass door to come out onto the balcony, that's when the cops started coming from everywhere. They take Delia Kettle, aka Mrs. Potts, into custody. They take her raggedy ass daughter Alicia into custody, and save Rosemary. And so I was like, oh my God, so what was happening was that when they were because she had those UV lights on him as well, on Daniel as well. So she was putting all that toxic cream on him while having these lights on him, which was causing the blistering and was causing him to not get better. And Rosemary was basically saying that, the cream in itself isn't fatal, but what it could have done was created sores, which could have gotten infected, he could have become septic, and that could have killed him. And in that way, she would have inherited whatever Daniel had. And so now you see Laura. After all of this is done, Laura is talking to Vicky, Sam's widow now, and telling her that it seemed like they were putting this juice or this toxic in the tea that he would drink, and that mixed with the heart medication that he was on, it was inevitable that it would eventually trigger a massive heart attack, which is what happened while he was driving and while he got into the accident. And Rosemary is now, talking to Daniel, who looks 100% better. And she was explaining to him about the trees, about how you said that it was a Malaysian family that actually created that garden. They imported some trees from Malaysia, and with it came this fungus, which is what that gelatinous, whatever that mess was that was on the trees. And that's what was killing the trees. And so she was basically explaining to him that he was going to lose so many trees, and then there would have to be so much treatment in order to correct the problem. But all in all, it's something that could be fixed. And so they talked for a little while, and of course he talked about how it was it's hard for him because she was so loving and so caring, and which is scary about it. She was all that while at the same time basically poisoning this man to death. And they said their goodbyes, and this is when I guess Laura and Rosemary decided that they would partner up, because Rosemary was like, so this is what it's like to be free. At this point, she's unemployed, and so, but she still has the expertise. So this is when they decide to go into business together, and this is where the episode ends. So, like I said, I do watch other shows that I really enjoy. A lot of them are kind of UK international shows, stuff like that. So I will try to post a recap once a week. Probably, it depends on what's going on, maybe a few times a week. So I can go get through the three seasons. But yeah, please, if you've seen this show, or if you like this show, like I said, the only place I've seen it at this point is on Britbox. So I would say check it out. But I am going to end this here because this video is longer than I expected, and I will talk to you guys later.